ちは。
はい、皆さんこんばんは。今日は祝日ですが夜の8時になりました。昨日のこの時間はウクライナキエフと結んでウクライナ情勢をお伝えしていましたが、今日も夕方現地にいる、カオル記者と連絡をしてですね、インタビューを取りました。今夜また皆さんにお届けできるかなと思いますが、今編集中です。また後ほどお伝えします。アクセスをしてみてください。昨日のアーカイブも、ありますので、ぜひ僕のチャンネルからアクセスをしていただけると大変ありがたいです。たくさんの方に見ていただいています。今日も国際情勢です。忘れてはいけない現場がミャンマーなんですね。8ビットニュースでは国連の機関、食糧計画の皆さん WFP の皆さんと共にですね、世界で支援を待つ現場の状況を現地の職員の皆さんなどと共に伝えてまいりました。特にミャンマーに関しては去年の2月のクーデター以降非常に厳しい市民生活に陥りました。暴力軍による非人道的な行いは世の中に伝わっているかと思いますが、その後1年以上にわたって深刻な食糧危機に直面しています。また各地域で戦闘が行われたということもあって国内避難民が急増したんですよね。そうした現場で、WFP の皆さんがさまざまな人道支援を続けてきました。今日はミャンマー食糧危機と題して最新映像とそしてアンコールインタビュー、昨年の秋にですね、現地で活動している WFP の担当者の方々などから情報を得てインタビューなども行いました。昨年も配信したんですが、そこを改めて今回再編集して皆さんに聞いていただこうとも思っております。やっぱり1年以上経って皆さんの記憶の中からミャンマーの窮状というのが薄れてるんじゃないかなという思いもあります。ですのでもう一度私たち日本人は一体何ができるのかということを一緒に考えてみませんか。今日も YouTube ライブたくさんのコメント早速いただいています。姉もねさんこんばんは。今日もよろしくお願いします。お願いします。美和さんこんばんは。こんばんは。若菜さん、ミャンマー情報待ってましたと。そう言っていただけると本当にありがたいですね。僕のところには在日ミャンマー人の方、現地でこの報道を知ったという現地のミャンマーの方、そしてミャンマーで企業活動をしている、非常に誠実な企業活動をしている現地法人関係者、いろんな方がミャンマーのことを堀さん伝えてね、伝えてくれてありがとうねって言っていただくんですけど、もう全然まだまだだと思っています。せめてものということで WFP の皆さんが現地に入ってくれていますので、その模様を皆さんにご覧いただきたいと思います。ついこの2月のですね、映像を送ってきていただきました。それでは早速ですが見ていただきましょう。こちらです。まず地図で確認ですが、海に面した町ですね、国ですね、その主要都市の一つヤンゴンのすぐ近くにある場所、今ちょうど拡大したこの現場が、つい先日送ってきていただきました WFP の活動域になります。現場ではですね、今配られているのは米などなんですが、食料が不足しています。詳しい数字などは後ほどお伝えしましょう。さまざまな活動をしているんですが、今見えているように食料を配布するだけではなくて、例えばですね、昨年の秋口10月以降 WFP は6ヶ月から59ヶ月の子どもたち や、妊産婦の皆さんや、女児6万4300人を対象に、包括的な栄養支援パッケージと、発育阻害予防、消耗症の予防と治療など、基本的には栄養を下支えするようなさまざまな支援パッケージですね、そうしたものを提供しましたよ。あとは現金や食料の支援とともに、HIV とともに生きる方々や結核患者の皆さんなどのサポートも行ってきたということです。月刊 WFP では、市民に直接こうやって一つ一つ渡す活動として、WFP の職員の皆さんの、活動の価値というのを伝えてきます。よく質問をねいただくんですよね。寄付をしたり、いろいろな物資を送ってもその現地の政府に渡って市民に届かないんじゃないんですかとか、今ご覧いただいているようにですね、WFP は国連の機関としてこのように直接、最も支援を待つ当事者の方々にしっかりと行き渡るような、ことを続けているんです。マキさんね、堀さんいつもミャンマーのことを忘れないでいてくれてありがとうとメッセージいただきました。こちらこそですね。今日はこのように現地の映像や現地で活動している職員の皆さんの声というのを後ほどしっかりとお伝えしていきますが、ちょっとデータもですね、最新のデータをいただいているので、その後皆さんに数字とともにお伝えしたいなと思っております。大体全体像が今どうなっているのかっていうのがなかなかよく分かってないんじゃないかなと思いますね。あとはですね、学校給食の再開であったりとか、高エネルギービスケットの持ち帰り廃棄、こちらはカチン州、シャン州北部で8万4500人の生徒に対して行ったということなんですね。WFP2020 年の倍以上の240万人に支援を広げました。それが2021年です。ヤンゴンやこちらも大きな都市マンダレ165万人に対して、さらには6つの州などから新たに避難してきた人たちも含んでいます。で、1月から状況が非常に深刻です。紛争の影響でラカインやカチン、シャン各州の国内避難民が急増、30万7千人の支援が必要なんですが、その支援に必要な400万ドルが枯渇ということで、1月から資金不足です。実際にミャンマーではすべての州と地域で武力衝突が報告されているといいます。特に北西部南東部での激しい戦闘が多くの人々の避難を強いています。こうした地域の方々への人道支援のニーズというのが高まっています。こうして地図で見てみるとミャンマーも山間部から都市部まで広いですよね。UNHCR、国連難民高等弁務官事務所の推計によると、昨年の11月の末現在でミャンマー全土で26万7500人が避難生活を強いられていて、物価が上昇しています。食料バスケットのコストは10ヶ月間で 29% の上昇と、燃料価格は去年2月の初めから、クーデターの頃ですね、71% の急騰を記録ということで、WFP の調査ではかなり食料やエネルギー事情が厳しいということが分かっています。で、2022年は人道的ニーズに対応するために400万人に食料が届くよう活動を強化する予定だというんですね。実際昨年の11月の時点でヤンゴンでは87万5千人の方々に米を配布と、そして各地の6ヶ月から59ヶ月の子ども10万7千人に1回限りですが緊急栄養配給を行っているということなんですね。こうして数字で見てみるとなかなか、どれぐらいの規模なんだろうかと、そういう思いもあるかもしれません。後ほど個人の顔が見えるような映像もあります。皆さんにここからお願いです。今後6ヶ月の間、今年の5月までの間に 6240万米ドルが必要なんです。で、先ほど申し上げましたように2022年1月にその急増する人道支援ニーズに対しての現金ベースの活動の資金というものが枯渇すると、WFP は発信しています。ですから、ミャンマーの皆さんを支えるためにも、この配信を見てくださっている余力のある方々、ぜひ力を貸してください。見ていただいたように直接支援が届きます。この配信の後半で毎回月刊 WFP でお伝えしているんですが、シェアザミールというアプリのことも紹介したいと思っています。皆さんこの現状を見てどんなことをお感じになりますか？ミャンマーは、大変なことですねと。ミャンマーデモから1年ですね、この1年の間に多くの方が犠牲になっています。10万ってすごい数だと思うとかですね。そうですよね。アジアの喧騒の中にいるみたいだなとか、いろいろこう皆さんから感想いただいていますが、同じ地域ですからね。それではインタビューお聞きいただきましょう。
Thank you very much for your time. First of all, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. Thank you very much, Kunjun, and it's very nice to be here with you today. My name is John Aliff. I'm the Regional Director for WFP in the Asia and Pacific region, and I'm based here in Bangkok, but WFP covers 16 countries across the region and has a portfolio of development and humanitarian projects, including in the countries you mentioned, but in 14 other countries as well.
And next, please tell us about your support in Myanmar.
Thank you. I'd like to say for Myanmar that it's been quite a difficult year for humanitarian operators in Myanmar. But first of all, and first and foremost, it's been a very, very difficult year for the Myanmar population. So as you'll recall, there was a coup on the 1st of February in which the military took over from the democratically elected government. And since then, the crisis in Myanmar has become much more complex. Unfortunately, its violence has become much more entrenched, and the prospects for Myanmar, and certainly for food security, have become increasingly bleak. From WFP's perspective in Myanmar this year, hunger is rising, and unfortunately, hunger is rising very quickly. A bit like Afghanistan, I'd like to make the point that before the coup on 1st of February 2021, food security and poverty were already rising, and they were rising because of COVID. We saw emerging already a desperate situation for households. We carried out surveys which showed that COVID had really impacted food security, and our partners carried out analyses which showed that poverty had even gone up, almost doubled in 2020. This was because families lost their jobs because of COVID. Families could not move because of COVID lockdowns. And while this is a story which many countries faced in Asia, in Myanmar it was particularly serious. COVID really made an impact. On top of that, then we had the coup, and let me just describe a little bit how the coup has affected food security in Myanmar. We see a new face of hunger, and the new face of hunger is still rural, but it is increasingly urban. That new face of hunger is increasingly urban in Myanmar. Urban citizens who lost their jobs, who couldn't work because of protests on the streets of Myanmar's major cities, something we saw on the news across the last months, through disrupted economic activity. We've carried out surveys in the last months in Myanmar, surveys in which we talked to the population, we analyzed their food needs. And those surveys reveal that 60 to 80% of Myanmar's families today are struggling with reduced income levels and struggling to feed themselves. 90% of them are having to borrow money or or take food on credit in order to feed their families, and yet half of those families have been forced to reduce food intake, to reduce the amount of food that they eat. And so we are very, very worried at the moment. Already earlier this year, around May, WFP predicted, as we saw the urban hunger rising, we predicted that an additional 3.4 million people in Myanmar were food insecure. And that meant at the time that 10% of Myanmar's population was food insecure. What we're seeing now is the situation, because of the protracted crisis and some of the factors that I'll come on to talk about, particularly the conflict, we're seeing now that that situation is deteriorating quite rapidly and will get worse in the weeks to come. So we've seen this first chapter of worsening food security, but we really think that things are going to get bad. Just looking at the slide there, if I may, we're seeing new needs arising, and so we've seen new displaced people, and more than 200,000 people have been displaced since February. What does that mean? It means that because of new fighting, intensification of fighting in the military, and some of the ethnic armed organizations, or some of the groups that have just emerged in opposition to the military, that new fighting has caused more than 200,000 people to move from their homes. Already in Myanmar, as you see from the slide, WFP was feeding 360,000 people in conflict-affected areas. These are areas that have been affected by conflict, some of them for many years. And these are populations that are in camps or have been really restricted from working. And those people depend almost entirely on WFP's food, the food we give them every month. And 360,000 of them we've been helping for years, actually. And we've sustained that through this period. It's been very challenging, but we've sustained our support to them. I should mention, because we are coming on to talk about Bangladesh, I should mention that quite a high proportion of that 360,000 are Rohingya, the Rohingya population, those who stayed behind in Myanmar, those who did not become refugees in Bangladesh. And so that population in particular is vulnerable, and we will need to continue fighting for them. If we could just go back in the slides to Myanmar would be great. Thank you. In Myanmar, WFP, if we could go back to Myanmar on the slides, I'd appreciate it. In Myanmar, WFP is one of the largest aid agencies on the ground. Generally, we feed about 1 million people every year with humanitarian work. We feed malnourished children. We do school feeding, feeding within schools, which encourages children to come to school. And we try to build the resilience of the population. Myanmar is prone to natural disasters, floods, cyclones, and we try and work with communities to make sure that when those disasters strike, they are more ready to withhold and withstand those crises. But I would say that now we're entering a critical period. WFP is responding with a new program in urban areas, but we're just not very well funded. And so we're trying to reach 2 million people, very, very poor people in places like Yangon and Mandalay and some of the other big cities of Myanmar. We've been unable to reach them because we don't have enough funding. We've reached roughly half of those. And the new displaced, the 200,000, we cannot gain access to them. We can't get in to those conflict areas to feed them. And so we're very, very concerned that humanitarian access is being restricted, that we're not getting the access that we need.
The people facing the more serious situation.
We fundamentally agree with you. And I think what we're going to see in the coming months is an increase in hunger, an increase in malnutrition, because this crisis is not going away. And so at WFP, as we enter this new period of rising hunger, we need three things. The first is all parties to this conflict must respect humanitarian law and facilitate our access. We must get in to feed people who have had to flee from their homes but have no means to sustain themselves and no means to feed their families anymore. We must be granted access. The second thing we need is funding. It's amazing that in spite of the prominence of this crisis in international media, more funding has not flown and been put into Myanmar. What we've seen, of course, naturally, is development funding has stopped because development donors naturally do not want to continue supporting a government which is not a legitimate government, as we say. But what we need is an uptick, an increase in humanitarian funding. And the third thing, of course, we need is a political solution. And so we are backing and hoping very much for a political solution to this crisis, which will allow Myanmar's economy to get back on track and therefore hunger to be brought under control.
Nhà xa là phải thêm thêm cái này.
Nên đặc ha mà, cái cái khu vừa sẽ đã lâu thì ngay quay đồ ra lâu rồi, đặc ha mà gì, cũng đi trên này mà thôi, rồi lại lâu rồi, rồi mình sẽ đầu mình đã được lâu rồi.
Giấy thật lưu này không, sưu đau về bà này, nhà này là phải sẽ cố bị, thì lo làm việc lưu bị đó là anh ấy lo rồi tôi nhảy đồng trả đấy, thì cái phải làm mấy việc, những cái cho ra lại xem ra việc, xây thêm một ngọn, quan ra việc tôi nhảy đồng trả anh ấy đó.
Please tell us about the Rohingya and the minority people in Bangladesh.
Thank you for asking about Bangladesh. It still remains one of the most critical parts of our regional program. There are 860,000 refugees in the Cox's Bazar districts of Bangladesh. And I was thinking back earlier to when this happened, 2017. I was country director in Bangladesh about a decade ago, and we had Rohingya refugees, but there were 30,000 of them. And in 2017, within the space of just a few days, about 900,000 or 1 million people just came across the border in one flood of people. And WFP was on the ground with its partners trying to respond and start feeding these people almost overnight. I think we need to pay tribute to the government of Bangladesh for hosting about nearly 900,000 refugees in one of the most poor areas of Bangladesh. And so we are feeding these people every day. We're doing it with one of the most innovative methods that I've seen in my 30 years in the World Food Programme. In the past, we used to just give food to beneficiaries once a month, and they used to queue up once a month, get the bags of food, and they used to take them back to their refugee shelters, and then a month later they would come back. We've completely revolutionized that in Bangladesh. WFP has built 22 shopping centers, actually, 22 supermarkets. And in addition to those 22 supermarkets, we've got 15 outlets providing fresh foods. The refugees, they get like a credit card. It's like a debit card, actually. A plastic card, which has their name and their fingerprint in there. And every month we charge that up with money, and they go shopping in the supermarket which we built. This is a whole new way of doing business, but it means so much more dignity for refugees. And so those 860,000 people, every single family within them uses the system of the debit card and going to the supermarket. And WFP has created this from scratch in the last 4 years. What this does is help the refugees. It gives them, there are more than 20 food items they can choose from, dried fish, fresh foods, but it does more things than that. We buy that fresh food from the local economies, from local farmers, and those local farmers benefit from providing fresh foods to the camps. And overall, if you look at how much money is injected into the local economy, it's about $11 million a year through employing people and paying them in cash, as well as buying local produce for distribution in the refugee camps. So this is a new type of thing. It's very important that we feed people in the local community as well. And so we have a school feeding program for them. And we've done a whole host of programs which benefit the local community, because that local community has ultimately been incredibly generous in welcoming and hosting so many refugees.
Nearly 900,000 Rohingya live in camps in Bangladesh, with the main camp hosting 600,000 people in just 13 square kilometers, which is the population of Washington, D.C., in an area 1/8 the size. The Rohingya are an ethnic minority who have faced decades of repression, persecution, and violence in Myanmar. On the 25th of August 2017, over 700,000 Rohingya crossed into Cox's Bazar, many with young children. They have since been living in the world's largest and most crowded refugee camp. Built on land that used to be a national park, bamboo and tarpaulin shelters cover the landscape, many of them perched on hillsides. The camps we see today are much more established. Out of $1 billion spent on the humanitarian operation, the World Food Programme alone spends 1/3, $300 million every year, with the monthly assistance package valued at over $13 an individual. This video will show you some of the transformational change that has been possible through the hard work of humanitarian partners and the Rohingya themselves. WFP delivers food to the entire Rohingya population in Cox's Bazar. The introduction of electronic vouchers has transformed the way they receive this food. The Rohingya use a WFP assistance card topped up with $11 a month, which can be redeemed at outlets run by local retailers in the camps. Families can choose to spend their money on fresh vegetables as well as eggs and dried fish, while local producers have a steady market. To enhance nutrition while also helping local farmers, WFP has set up fresh food corners offering vegetables in e-voucher outlets and piloted farmers markets for farmers to sell their produce directly to the Rohingya. Here you see a beneficiary classified as an extremely vulnerable individual, or EVI. This is the final step of the food distribution process, where we ensure that beneficiaries are claiming the correct allocation of food determined by the number of people in her household. As she is an EVI, the beneficiary will return home using the porter service, with food delivered to her door. While schools were closed during COVID-19, fortified biscuits previously provided as nutrition supplements in school were given out at e-voucher outlets in the camps. This is an integrated nutrition center run by WFP and UNICEF for children and women struggling with moderate and severe malnutrition. 45 integrated nutrition centers serve 200,000 women and children every month. As part of the Self-Reliance Program in 2020, 27,000 Rohingya were engaged in income-generating activities, such as vegetable production, aquaculture, and tailoring. During the pandemic, 150 women produced 700,000 reusable face masks for the camps and host communities. A recycling pilot collected, cleaned, and recycled over 300,000 aluminium-based packets and bottles. As the world tries to find its way out of the COVID-19 crisis, the Rohingya continue to face an uncertain future. The humanitarian community stands as committed as ever to providing a life of dignity and keeping their story alive in people's minds.
And emergency preparedness please mention about it.
Yeah, I mean, what we have to recognize is that this part of Bangladesh in which they live, like many parts of Bangladesh actually, is very prone to disasters. And so disasters strike almost every year. We have cyclones, and the cyclones come in the Bay of Bengal, and they devastate the landscape. And we have landslides. There's when a lot of rain comes, there are landslides. When there are fewer trees, mudslides come. Recently also, we've had fires within the camps. And so this is a disaster-prone area. WFP wants to give something back to the communities. And so we've invested with our engineers in certain projects, some of which you see covered here. In the Cox's Bazar district, first of all, there are cyclone shelters. When the cyclone's coming, the population all go to a cyclone shelter. This is a reinforced building above the land, which can withstand wind and storm surge. So water, waves of water coming through, surges of water, small floods, and heavy winds. And WFP has rehabilitated some of those 70 of those cyclone shelters. We've also made them accessible for disabled people, so that disabled people are not left behind. We've also planted trees, about 330,000 trees, and we work with the host communities to maintain those. Those are so important because you can imagine how many trees are cut down by the host population for firewood, and originally also by the refugees. So we're giving back and helping the environment by planting trees. We run a massive engineering operation. The camp that I talked about, the largest one in the world, it's like a small city. And so WFP and two other UN agencies, we run an engineering service where we employ 50,000 volunteers, and those volunteers help build the roads, maintain the roads in the camps, which we've built, maintain the slopes, make sure that there's no flooding. And these camps are some of the best I've seen because of that engineering work, but we couldn't do that without refugee volunteers and volunteers from the host community that help us. Just on emergency response again, I mentioned the fires. We've had various problems in the camps. There was a devastating fire a few months ago, which burned down the refugee homes of so many. We've also had floods more recently. And so what WFP did was we put small warehouses across many areas of the camp, so that as soon as there was a disaster, we could open the warehouses and bring food to families who had lost their homes in the case of the fires and also the floods. In the devastating fires and floods of 2021, WFP also switched immediately to providing hot cooked meals for refugees, as you see, for 1.1 million of them. because the refugees had lost their homes and therefore lost the ability to cook for themselves. So for short periods, we rush in and provide cooked meals as well. And so again, for the host community and for the refugees, this emergency preparedness and response activities are so critical because Bangladesh is so affected by disasters, by natural disasters.
Yeah. I think that there is not much information disseminated about the situation of ethnic minorities. Do you have any request to the mass media?
Thank you for raising that, June. It's critically important. And when you look at Asia, there's a lot of inequality, and that there's a lot of income inequality. There's a lot of inequality, gender inequality, but there's also inequality which disfavors the ethnic minorities. And I'm so glad to see you raise that. We would love the international media to cover the plight of some of the ethnic minorities more than they do today. It's a challenge because take a crisis like Afghanistan, which we've talked about. So 14 million people need food this year. It's easy when you get a huge number like that to just look at the big picture, and looking at the big picture is also important. But within that community, we've got ethnic minorities who were poorer than everyone else to start with, and who at the World Food Programme we take particular care of during this time. It is important for us to cover their needs as well. We have some countries, Laos is one of them, where there are immense numbers of ethnic minorities, all living with different issues, different languages, very hard for them to integrate economically, and they face challenges. But I would say, picking up on our conversation, that one of the most unfortunate and forgotten ethnic minorities in the world today are the Rohingya. And there are many ethnic minorities that we need to pay attention to, but my heart goes out to the Rohingya in particular. I have said many times that that humanity and history will judge us all as an international community, as a world community. We will be judged, and history will judge us on what we did for the Rohingya in these years of crisis, where 860,000 of them are living in Bangladesh. There are 600,000 left in Myanmar, by the way, still. And we see stories, which we're grateful that the media covers, by the way. We see stories of them trying to escape by boat. Often that ends tragically, but no one wants them. And that is heartbreaking. And so my plea then is for the media to cover ethnic minorities more generally, to try and get below those big numbers and look at the plight of ethnic minorities. But my plea in particular, at this particular moment in our history of the world, is really for the Rohingya.
Thank you very much. Afghanistan and Myanmar are countries that have a close relationship with Japan. However, I think that there are not enough voices of solidarity from the citizens. What do you expect from each and every Japanese person?
Well, I would slightly disagree with you, if I may, because actually Japan, for us in WFP, not only is a global donor, a very key global donor for the World Food Programme across the world, across the many crises we face, but actually in Asia is particularly an important donor for us. Let's take Afghanistan, for example. Japan has been with us for decades, literally, providing a lot of support for Afghanistan, particularly during the most crises, the most critical years of Afghanistan's history. This year, I should say, in 2021, WFP put out an appeal, a particular appeal for 2021. We knew the needs would be high. And the first donor in 2021 to respond was Japan, who provided $12.9 million as early as January. And so we're particularly grateful. But across the other programs that we've talked about today, Myanmar and Bangladesh, Japan has been a critical donor. The urban program in Myanmar, the one that was so important to start this year, the first donor to that was Japan. So that is your government, but I know that your government is also the Parliament of Japan is also very engaged. I personally had the great pleasure to meet the Parliamentary League of Japan, the one that supports WFP. They have visited Cox's Bazar, by the way, and visited the refugees, and they're extremely active. But those parliamentarians and your government represent the people of Japan, who have shown really undying generosity to the world's hungry. I'm very grateful for that. And let me take this opportunity really to thank, from the bottom of our hearts and on behalf of all the hungry people in Asia, to thank the Japanese people and the Japanese government.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John-san. Please give us the message about Afghanistan and Myanmar, and there is so many people, they need the help, helping. So please please give us your message.
There are many hungry people in this world today, and unfortunately, because of conflict and because of economic stagnation, which the COVID pandemic has brought, that number of people in the world who are hungry is rising. But my message is, I can't see any more desperate population in this world today than the ones in Afghanistan and Myanmar. The economic hardship is escalating and it's spiraling out of control. Hunger is rising at a rate that we've never seen in those countries. And so my message is, we must, as an international community, show solidarity with the people in those countries. Whatever we think of the politics of both governments is, for me, important, but we need to look beyond that. The humanitarian imperative is very strong. Hunger is rising. We must not let the children in those countries die of malnutrition. And the World Food Programme is there on the front lines responding, and we really appreciate both the world's attention to hunger, in those countries, but particularly your support through WFP.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Interview has done. Thank you.
June, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you. I've been an admirer and heard a lot about you. I've watched your other interviews, and it's so nice to meet you. Once again, thank you very, very much for supporting hunger.
Yeah.
Thank you for supporting WFP. We really appreciate it.
どういたしまして。ありがとうございました。
さあ皆さん、インタビュー聞いていただいて、現地のリポートもご覧いただきました。いかがだったでしょうか。皆さんのね YouTube ライブのコメントを見ながら質問も途中たくさんいただきまして、本当にありがとうございます。さまざまな国連機関がある中でも、この WFP という組織は、一昨年ノーベル平和賞も受賞しましたが、こうした紛争や飢餓、貧困、迫害、さまざまな事情から手元に食料がないという方々に直接食料を手渡す組織です。そのためには飛行機も使うし、水陸両用車も使うし、もちろん陸路、人力でも運ぶしと、何としてでも届けるというのが彼らの方法です。で、僕もWFP が運営しているアンハスという航空会社ですねの飛行機に乗って、民間航空機が飛んでいないスーダンの紛争地域に入ることができました。飛行機も運営しているのかって当時驚いたんですよね。で、今ありましたが、中長期的な形での支援ってどうなんですかと、ぜひ月刊WFP のアーカイブをご覧になってみてください。 今日は英語でのインタビューでしたけれども、同じ母国語日本語を話す日本ルーツの職員の皆さんなども各地で奮闘していまして、分かりやすくまたさらにお話をしてくださっている現場もあります。8ビットニュースのアーカイブに月刊 WFP がありますので、ぜひご覧いただきたいんですね。そして日本国は支援国の一つだということで感謝の気持ちを述べていただきましたが、皆さん知ってましたかと。今日知ったからには何かやりたいという方は、この番組で毎回お伝えしているこちらのアプリ、シェアザミールというアプリがあります。このシェアザミールというアプリは大変優秀なアプリで、今映っているのはニカラグアの子どもたちの話ですね。こんな風に映像とですね、テキストで現地の様子がわかります。スワイプすると隣はルワンダですね。WFP が関わっている食料を待っている現場の情報とともに今寄付するということができます。この黄色い部分をタップすると皆さんが一皿100円未満単位で寄付することができます。自分で今日はじゃあ何円とかね、今月はまとまったお金でちょっと寄付しようかなとかで、今ご覧いただいているのは世界の子どもたちに食事を届けようと。これね、今、航空機からねバーッとばらまいたのはあれ米とか小麦とか、その地域に必要とされている食料資源ですよ。はい、あんな風に配ったりもするんですよ。すごいですよね。っていう活動を皆さんが支えることができます。今寄付するという黄色いところをタップするとですね、例えばですね、こういうサイトに飛びます。今1食85円と出てますけれども、これ下にっこりマークみたいになってますが、この青い部分をこう動かすと1105円とかね出るじゃないですか要はだから自分で選べるんです、金額を。でそのままじゃあ僕は今世界の子どもたちに入れましょう、届け1625円。お支払い方法、僕アップルなんでアップルペイでお支払いができますよということで、このままクレジットカード経由ですね、できましたみたいにですね、簡単に皆さんできますので、シェアザミールと検索してみてください。ありがとうございました。月刊 WFP、つい先日 WFP の日本の事務所の皆さんともお話をいろいろさせていただいて、ぜひ定期的に継続してこの春からも配信したいなと思っております。こういう形で一度発信したものも今の最新情報と合わせてもう一回皆さんにご覧いただいてもいいかなと思って、今回はミャンマークーデターから1ヶ月が経過した、現場についてお伝えしました。そして昨日の深夜、そして今日、ミャンマー現地で活動している方から連絡を受けました。非常に辛い話でしたね。今は表立って軍が銃で人を撃ち殺すなんていうことが横行している状況ではないですと。ですから見る人が見たら活気が戻ってきたね、落ち着いてきたね、もう大丈夫だねっていう方もいるんだけれども、実際何が行われているかというと、深夜に軍人が、突然押し入ってきて逮捕、そして、懲役刑とかですね、尋問、夜中に突然やってくる、何も悪いことしてません。もちろん悪いことっていうか、もうただそこで暮らしているだけなのにゴンゴンゴンゴンと夜中に軍が来て、でこれはいわゆる恐怖の支配だということなんですね。ですから目に見えた暴力があるわけではないので、この国際社会では伝わりづらいですよね。国際社会で伝わりづらいということは、非難の声が各国から上がりづらいということで、そうなった時にその市民の皆さんたちの思いというのは一体誰が伝えるんだろうかと。8ビットニュースでは市民の皆さんと共に発信を、行う活動を10年続けてきました。 WFP をはじめとした NGO や NPO の活動を支えることもやりたいということで、この数年発信を共にしてきました。ぜひ皆さんが報道などを通じて見えている世界が全てではないんだという想像力を持ってこうした発信を支えていただければと思います。今回はミャンマー食糧危機最新映像、そしてアンコールインタビューご覧いただきました。ではまた次回もぜひご覧ください。チャンネル登録や、今回のね映像いいねと押していただいたりシェアしていただいたりすると、また多くの方々に届くのかなと思いますので、メッセンジャーとしても皆さんのお力をお貸しください。ではまた、次回お会いしましょう。8ビットニュースは、この後配信はないんですが発信はあります。そして明日はなんと立て続けに3本、番組が配信されます。7時台、そして9時台、そして10時台です。7時台は原発事故で被災された方々が国や東京電力を訴えている、訴訟、なりわい訴訟の弁護団を率いる間木伊豆太郎弁護士の憲法いろはの日、そして夜9時台はですね、平壌が舞台です。朝鮮民主主義人民共和国、北朝鮮の若者と日本の若者たちの交流で、分断された世界をつないでこようという活動をしてきた NGO 日本国際ボランティアセンターの月刊 JVC、 そして夜10時半からは、ダウン症の子どもたち、DS と呼んでいますが我々は、DS 虹色子育て、ダウン症の子どもたちを育てるお母さんお父さんたちがいろいろな皆さんからの質問、お悩み、相談事、ぜひつながりましょうということで中島真美さんを中心に発信をしてくれています。夜10時半からですけれどもぜひご覧ください。相当いろいろやってますんで、チャンネル登録もお願いします。それではまた。